Hi everyone. I would like to welcome you to our 12th content webinar. First off, I want to congratulate all of you that have managed to complete all three of the projects that were due last Sunday. This is a huge achievement, and you should be very proud of yourselves. The amount of work and determination needed was immense, but you managed to complete it in time. Hopefully, you learned a ton of new stuff along the way. Also, if you took the time to submit your GitHub and LinkedIn accounts for review and got them accepted, this means that you are very close to being a worthy job candidate. When you graduate, the effort that it takes to complete a nano degree, coupled with certified accounts on GitHub and LinkedIn, will make your job application stand out amongst the crowd. Actually, GitHub and LinkedIn are the two major websites that employers look on for future job applicants and for their future employees. So having a good account on GitHub and on LinkedIn will equip you with edge over your rivals, so to speak. For the ones that are still in the process of completing the projects, don't give up. I mean, I'm sure that you're just a small step away from the success. And if there's anything I can help you with, I'm here all the time, pretty much. So don't hesitate to reach out and we'll solve the problems together. Next up, I want to say that there is less than a month until the end of the nano degree. The end is marked for the 23rd of June, which is actually the deadline for your next and your last project. Speaking of that project, it's an application that you have to optimize. The app and its functionality is already working, but you'll have to transform it into a fully functioning, responsive, and accessible web app that even works offline. That said, this will be a hard project, but with the amount of skills that you gained these past months, I'm sure that you can do it. As always, you have my help at your disposal if you should ever need it. Um, okay, so with that out of the way, let's discuss the topic of this content webinar. Um, what we're going to discuss today is very fundamental in the world of web development. It is responsive web design. Nowadays, as you probably know, most of the web is accessed via phones, tablets, phablets, and other mobile devices. This was not the case back in the day. Um, People only had the desktop to browse the internet. Uh, Today, it's our jobs as web developers to make our websites and our applications appear great both on mobile and desktop to accommodate the ever-growing number of mobile users. This is an interesting topic, which I think you'll like, and it will, without a doubt, feature in most of the work you do as a professional developer. You'll also have to make the app in the final project responsive as well. So what you'll learn in the next few minutes is fully applicable to the requirements for your final project. So without further ado, let's start. I've made a presentation for you again, which I'm going to share after the webinar because I think that it's better for you to see what we're talking about instead of just looking at me. So let me share the screen with you. Here we go. That's my screen. And there's the presentation. Um, this is our topic. responsive web design. Um, this is the agenda of topics that we will aim to cover. I just want to mention that responsive web design is a huge topic which consists of many subtopics, and it will be impossible to explain all these topics in the little amount of time that we have. Some of these topics are so big that they deserve a whole another degree dedicated to them specifically. This is why we'll not delve into much detail on some topics and focus more on the more important ones. I have provided resources at the end of the presentation on every topic that we're going to discuss. So if you want to know more about something in particular, the links are there for you to follow. Also, there are many resources out there, um, or sources of information for all these topics. Responsive web design may be a bit new technology, but it's growing fast, and new content is generated pretty much every day. So there is a wide array of information online if you choose to follow that up. Okay, so first off, we'll begin with providing a definition about web design and what it's all about. What does it do for us, and the projects we will be working on in the future. Once we find out that responsive web design is actually a state of mind or a process of sorts, we will have to decide on a strategy for the projects if we choose to adopt the responsive web design approach. Um, there are two general strategies when it comes to responsive web design, and those are desktop first and mobile first. And in this section, we will have a discussion on when we should use one of them and when we should use the other. Um, we can't just adopt one of these approaches and approach every project the same way. Um, these strategies are appropriate depending on the projects that we will be working on. Um, After that, we come to the cornerstone of responsive web design, and this is the meta viewport tag. This is the HTML element without which we would be immensely troubled to do anything responsive. You'll see why this simple HTML element is so important in just a few minutes. We'll move on to an equally important tool that we need to have in our responsive web design belt, and that is media queries. I'm sure you've heard about media queries before. Actually, most of the responsiveness that we'll be implementing will be in media queries. So it is of great importance that we get a solid understanding of how they work, how we write them, and so on. Then we will see some of the tools for responsive web design. I'm pretty sure that you've encountered and even used some of them in your own projects. We even had a separate webinar dedicated to one of them. As you might remember, that is Flexbox. There are, however, some more which we will address when we get to that part of the presentation. Then we will see something really interesting. A few years ago, Google published something that really shook the web development world. It was so groundbreaking that some people actually compared it to Armageddon. Uh, Hence, that's where the name Mobile Geddon comes from. We will see exactly what that is in a bit. And finally, we will see how our trusty sidekick Chrome's DevTools will help us in making our websites more responsive. Bear in mind that if you're using a different browser than Google Chrome, It probably has its own dev tools, which you can definitely use as well. For simplicity's sake, however, I have only included Google's dev tools in this webinar. Most modern browsers like Firefox, Safari also have their own dev tools. I think Opera has dev tools as well, so you should have no problem whatsoever. And of course, the final part of the presentation consists of links to useful articles and explanations on the topics we're about to cover. And this is actually everything that we'll try to cover, so let's get going. Firstly, let's explain what responsive web design is. Here we have a quote from a famous person called Josh Clark, who is known for his contributions to the web developer community and his research into web design. He said that content is like water. So you put water in a teacup, it becomes the cup. You put water in a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put water in a teapot, and it becomes the pot. Essentially, he compares the content that is on our web pages to water and the manner in which water flows seamlessly from one container to another. So, water is physically very adaptive. You can pour it into anything, and it will still find its way. So it will still um, flow and contain in whatever we put it into. Much like that, we should adapt. We should make our content adaptable to whatever viewport or whatever device we're viewing it on. So um, here's a more graphical illustration of what Josh Clark said. Sadly, though, most of the time, and I know that you've experienced this, content on web pages looks nice, but once you try to access it from a smaller or larger device, all kinds of weird things start happening. Um, Images start to overlap text, containers have too small space in them, and elements get crammed. The font size is too big or too small, all that kind of stuff. Um, I don't know about you, but my reaction to this is to immediately leave the website. Now that is not good for you as a developer. You want as much users to spend as much time as possible on your website. However, this requires our content to flow like water from one device to another. In our example, though, content that breaks and looks bad on a smaller or larger device is more like concrete rather than water. So it's set for the device that it was designed for and does not fit on smaller or larger devices. Notice how nicely the same amount of water flows from the desktop to the mobile device. If you try putting concrete from here, from this milk bottle, into the teapot, you'll most likely break that. Well, in our case, our content is not going to break the device that we're trying to view it on, but it will look very bad, which is equally discouraging. So, all this explanation leads us to the topic itself. So responsive web design is an approach to using HTML and CSS to automatically resize, hide, shrink, or enlarge a website to make it usable on multiple devices. In other words, using responsive design, we can make our content turn from concrete into water and flow seamlessly into every device regardless of its screen size. So, notice that we're using only HTML and CSS to make our web designs responsive. You already know HTML and CSS, so you should hit the ground running in this topic. Responsive web design is a relatively new concept. Actually, its birth dates back to 2013 when Ethan Marcotte wrote an article for the famous website called A List Apart. I think that one of the days I sent you this website as a kind of resource. You should definitely keep an eye on this website and visit it um, once in a while, because the things that are the articles that appear there are written by top-notch professionals which really know all about web development, and I really urge you to learn from them as much as you can and read what they have to say. So, a list apart, that's a very important site to know. Um, in the article, he coined the term responsive web design as being what we described a moment ago. The reason for this late appearance of the term is quite obvious, actually, if you think about it. Back in the days, people only had desktop computers to browse the web from. So there was actually no need for developers to adapt their designs to smaller or larger screen sizes simply because there were no such devices. Today, however, pretty much everyone has some kind of mobile device which he uses to browse the web from. The number you see here, 51%, is the proportion of the total internet traffic that is taken up from mobile devices. Today, we can officially confirm that users with some form of mobile device account for more internet traffic than users with desktop computers. Um, I don't know about you, but this is quite overwhelming, this fact, because um, smartphones have only been around since, I don't know, um, 10, 12 years. I remember when I first saw the my first smartphone. It was an iPhone. Actually, I was still in school, so a colleague of mine or a co-student, she had her first iPhone 4, I think, or 3 actually. I think it was an iPhone 3, and it was like it was this mad gadget that everyone wanted to have, and I had never seen anything like it before. And actually, the first iPhone I got was like, I don't know, maybe 2014, which was 5 years ago, if you think about it. So now, everyone has mobile phones, um, and we all tend to browse the web from there because most of the time we're on the go and not in front of a computer, and that makes total sense. But um, here, this number, 51%, like more than half of all the internet traffic comes from mobile devices, which is quite interesting since they've only been around for like 10 to 15 years. But that's the state of things. So, what this number means is that your app is more likely to be viewed by a person on a phone rather than on a person on a desktop computer, which is what you use to develop the app actually. Most of the time we're developing on desktops and not phones, because imagine what developing on a phone would be like. This huge number necessitates the implementation of responsive web design because nowadays, if your website or app does not have a mobile version, that means that you're losing massive amounts of potential users. So you could, according to this number here, you could increase your internet traffic to the web app that you've built by half if you make mobile version of the site. So now that we know what responsive web design is and why we should adopt it, this is a metaphorical description of what a responsive website looks like. Um, on the face of it, users get a perfectly responsive website which is pleasant to interact with on all kinds of screen sizes. What users see is the tip of the iceberg right here. Little do they know that under the surface, in the depths of the source code, there is a huge part of the iceberg that consists of three main features, which account for the responsiveness that users see. These three technologies are what we use to make our site responsive. All of them are equally important and complement each other. To make a site truly responsive, we need to have some kind of flexible and fluid grid system. This is achieved by the CSS modules Flexbox or CSS Grid or I don't know, some third-party libraries like Bootstrap, which is um, very popular. Um, then, after we implement some kind of flexible grid layout, um, we use media queries to fine-tune the content on the different viewports. Note that these two technologies, so the media queries and the flexible grid layouts, are part of the CSS programming language. Flexible images, though, can be implemented using HTML as well. So um, we need our knowledge of both HTML and CSS, like I said in the beginning, to make our sites responsive. Flexible images are images that look well on all kinds of devices. So these three concepts here, CSS3 media queries. So before we had CSS2, the media queries there were pretty basic and weren't of much use as they are now uh, in the current versions of CSS3. So with media queries, flexible images, and a flexible grid layout, we can build a truly responsive website. Once we make the decision to make our websites responsive, we have another important thing to consider. We have to decide what kind of approach we will use to make the website responsive. There are two more popular approaches out there, desktop first and mobile first. Before we explain the two approaches, let's discuss what breakpoints are. So, if you look at the word semantically, breakpoint, you can separate it into two other words. One of them is break and the other is point. So, it will be some kind of point that something breaks. So that's the semantic part of it. I am sure that you can deduce from this explanation what we're about to talk about. So let's get to it. So breakpoints are the pixel value of when our content no longer looks right, or when our content breaks. Our design, the way we design the content initially breaks. So if you open up a website in your browser and try to shrink the browser window, at some point you're going to notice that the content starts moving around, expanding, shrinking, and exactly when this process of transformation produces some kind of undesirable result, we take a look at the pixels and we have a breakpoint. And that's essentially what breakpoints are. They are pixel values according to which we have to design our responsiveness. Here we have a note that we should design our breakpoints according to the content and not to typical device widths. This is pretty important. We'll have a more detailed discussion about this in a bit, For now, I simply wanted to draw your attention to this, and we will see what this actually means in a bit. So I know this is a bit of an overwhelming, graph or picture, but bear with me. We'll explain everything. So here is a pretty good depiction of the two approaches. So notice that we have mobile first here and desktop first here. Um, in the middle, we have an arrow, a spectrum of sorts. So it starts from 0 pixels and goes all the way to infinity. So it is separated into multiple sections. Actually, there are 4 of them, from 0 to 600, from 600 to 900, 900 to 1200, and from 1200 beyond. So um, each of them accounts for some kind of pixel amount. Here we have 600 pixels, 300, 300, and infinity. So actually, these here lines, these small lines here, are the breakpoints we discussed a moment ago. Here we have three breakpoints at 600, at 900, and 1200 pixels. This is where our content breaks and starts to behave in a weird way. Now notice how we have mobile first here and oops, sorry, mobile first here and desktop first here. They are at the opposite ends of the spectrum that we write our initial code. So depending on what approach we're gonna choose, our initial code goes either here in the last breakpoint or here in the first one. So if we choose to go desktop first, we'd write our initial code at the far end of the spectrum that is beyond 1200 pixels. This is what you've been doing all this time, writing code for desktops and adapting it to look good on smaller devices. Also, if we choose desktop first, notice how we're using the max width media queries. Um, we will explain what media queries are. I just want to show this that we use max width as the rule. Um, this max width, for example, of 600 pixels, means that any device that has a screen with a smaller or equal to this pixel amount, the code we put in this breakpoint will be run. So if we have some kind of small device with a screen that has a maximum width, so the maximum width in pixel amount of the screen can be 600 or less. So if we have a phone with a resolution that has a width of 600 pixels or less, um, the code that we put inside this breakpoint will be run. The same goes for between 600 and 900 and between 900 and 1200. Actually, it's just the opposite when we decide to go mobile first. We put our initial code at the beginning of the spectrum, so here below 600 pixels. Um, and to put rules for larger screen sizes, we use min width this time. Here, notice min width. Um, when we use min width, we say that any device which has a screen width equal to or bigger than the set pixel amount. So for here it's 600, 900, 1200. We'll run the code inside this breakpoint. So this is pretty much the essence of the two approaches. Also, a thing that we should always remember is that notice here the text box I have put. Media queries don't add any specificity to CSS selectors. This is why we should always take care to put our media queries at the end of our style sheets. So we write the code that we want, and at the very end, we put our media queries. And that's basically it for desktop and mobile first approaches in a nutshell. So as you can see here, if we try to go mobile first, we should put our initial code right here um, in the first breakpoint. And if we go desktop first, we should put it right here at the end of the spectrum. Um, um, Note that these breakpoints are just randomly chosen. You don't have to use these breakpoints. I have just put them here to illustrate what I'm talking about. Okay, so let's move on. Here are the pros and cons of using a mobile first approach. You can assume that the pros and cons for desktop first will be the exact opposite of these. That's because notice how we had the desktop first exactly in the opposite end of the spectrum to mobile first. So um, we can conclude that the pros and cons will be exactly the opposite. So that's why I haven't included a separate slide for the for the desktop first approach. Um, First off, we understand that using a mobile first approach guarantees us a 100% optimized mobile experience, which is kind of obvious actually. You mean it's mobile first, of course, but I've listed it here anyways. The next benefit is that it reduces websites to the absolute essential pieces of content. This is because we have a limited canvas which we can paint our creative ideas on. So we have a small screen that we can only include so much content before it starts to look bad. Also, reducing the content we serve to the user makes for a smaller and hence faster product. Finally, when we use mobile first, we prioritize content over aesthetics. So we prioritize content over the way how our website looks because, as we mentioned a minute ago, we don't have the space to be too creative. Some of the downsides of this approach are that when we look at the website on a larger screen, we might feel that there is too much space left. Also, as I mentioned, the practice of developing desktop first has been around since the very beginning, and switching from that approach to a totally different, opposite actually approach is not easy by any means. So, since the beginning of the web, uh, developers have been designing desktop first approach without knowing it. And now that we have a mobile first approach, we're supposed to forget all the years of experience that we have and start developing by in a totally opposite way. This is not very easy, but as you gain more practice, um, it starts to be natural. Also, for beginners like you, um, you don't have this practice of developing desktop first. So maybe approaching your projects with a mobile first approach will not be as hard for you as professional developers find it nowadays. Okay, so the next disadvantage, in addition to the previous ones, is that web designers might find it difficult to design something great, something that stands out for such smaller screens. Also, if we take this approach, we might not have enough time to make a desktop prototype of the project deadline, if the project deadline that we have by our managers or our bosses is too tight. This might throw off some clients because they're most probably used to seeing desktop versions of prototypes and not some kind of mobile version. So this might cause a problem in some cases. So in general, before choosing our approach, we should ask ourselves a simple question. What is the purpose of our website? Not all websites, as I mentioned before, need to be optimized for all screens. Sometimes just one of the versions will do. I mean, if you're trying to build some kind of app that's going to be centered around people that sit in front of a desktop device, it doesn't make any sense to go mobile because your audience most probably won't use that. So that's about it for the mobile first characteristics. Now that we know those two approaches, what those two approaches consist of, let's go back to breakpoints. Um, there are three ways of selecting breakpoints for app projects. There's the good, the bad, and the perfect. Disclaimer I want to put out immediately is that sadly, most websites nowadays um, follow the bad approach. However, bad doesn't necessarily mean bad because it's better to have a badly designed responsive website than a website that's not responsive at all. So if if you only can implement the bad approach, there's no problem really with that because in the end you have a responsive website. So um, if you can't do anything, if you can't do the good or the perfect approach, don't worry, go with the bad for now. So the bad approach is to determine our breakpoints based on popular devices screen sizes. Unsurprisingly, the most used products are the Apple products. This approach is very limited because nowadays there is an extremely wide variety of devices with all sorts of screen sizes, so there's no way that our Apple product aimed breakpoints will look good on these other devices. So if you only design for Apple's products, you will most likely leave out the users of Samsung, HP, Asus, and all of the other manufacturers which have chosen a different screen size for their users, for their products, excuse me. So you will leave out the users of all these products just to go for um, the users of a specific brand, which is not the best approach that you can take. A better approach, so the good approach, aims to group many devices according to their screen size. This means that we have a standardized screen size for all phones, for all tablets, for tablet landscape mode, and all the rest. This is a better approach than the last one, and it will work most of the time just fine. However, there is an even better way we can do things. The perfect way to make our websites responsive is to shrink or expand our website manually until our design breaks. Wherever this happens, we put a breakpoint there. This ensures that we will get the exact amount of breakpoints we need, no more and no less. If you're designing for specific devices, you'll most likely end up with a huge amount of breakpoints because, like I said, there's a huge array of devices out there. However, this is the most difficult approach of them all because it requires a lot of expertise and a big amount of skill. This is why, for now, I would recommend you. Start out with the good approach, and when you feel comfortable with it, move on to the perfect approach. Here is a visual representation of how screen resolutions are grouped into clusters to create these general breakpoints that we see here. So the 600, the 900, the 1200, and the 1800 pixel breakpoints. Um, mm, it's unlikely that these breakpoints will change much in the next 2 or 3 years, but you can always check them out on the website of StatCounter that you see here. This is where this table was prepared from. So whenever you feel that you want to check whether these breakpoints have moved in any way, go to StatCounter and you'll find the the general screen size is there. Here is an example of how a content flows water-like across devices. Notice how the colored sections adapt to the screen widths of these three devices. So no content overlaps the other sections, or tablet or on the phone. The sections shrink and expand as the screen size changes, and in fact, this is more or less what we will be doing every time we design a responsive website. It's changing the dimensions of these big sections to fit on these small screens. Here is something I really want to stress on because it's extremely important. You should never design only for one of the versions and leave the other as an afterthought. Always keep mobile and desktop in mind. No matter what approach you choose, or desktop first or mobile first, you should always, no matter what, keep in mind how the design of the opposite end of the web design spectrum will look like. Remember this. This is very important. Um, This is probably the most important thing that we decide to make our websites responsive. Um, it's the meta viewport tag, and here it is. This is the HTML tag that makes designing responsive websites possible. If we don't include this tag in the head element of our HTML document, it's virtually impossible to make a site responsive. So this is number one on the list of steps that we should take to make our websites responsive. Now we'll look at the tools that we will be using to tell the browser what it should render on the respective screen sizes. Or actually, let me tell you a bit more about the meta viewport tag. So what the meta viewport tag does for us is to um, persuade the browser to recognize the device screen size. So some devices, if you don't include this meta viewport tag, report their screen size falsely. So you get the wrong resolution, and instead of getting the correct resolution and applying the correct breakpoints and media queries, you end up with some kind of false claim about the device's screen size, which leads to your website behaving in a weird way. That's why the meta viewport tag is important. So back to media queries. Media queries are part of the CSS language. These are rules that we place for the browser to interpret based on the screen size. Notice the query parameter right here. We pass in the parentheses. This query will contain the resolution of the breakpoint we want to place rules for. Actually, we should have as many media queries as there are breakpoints in our design. Once we set up the media query for the respective breakpoint, All that's left is to place the actual CSS rules inside of these curly braces right here. Um, what we write inside the curly braces is plain CSS. There is nothing special about it, nothing different. It's just like the CSS we would write outside of media queries. We just put it inside here. Once we set up the meta viewport tag and all of our media queries, the browser will automatically pick the correct media query based on the device screen size and apply all the rules that we have specified right here in the media query in question. And that's actually all there is to it. We set up the meta viewport tag, do some media queries, and adapt the responsive images to the respective resolutions. Also note that this right here is the media query blueprint. This is not an actual media query. This is the general way in which we write media queries. Um, Now here are the parameters that we can pass inside of the parentheses. So remember the query parameter that we had right here, query. This is where we put our parameters. These parameters will replace the query parameter we saw a minute ago. Here I have listed all of them. Um, they are pretty self-explanatory, but let's go through some of them. Min width, right here at the top, will specify the rules to be applied when the browser window width is equal to this width or is higher. Remember, or is higher. The opposite goes for max width. So remember, those two are the ones that we used for we saw for mobile first and desktop first respectively. So if we use a mobile first approach, we use min width, and for desktop first, we use the max width. Um, the same goes for the min height and the max height parameters, but they are about the height of the screen size. So they're basically the same, only for the height, actually. Now, the orientation parameter is a bit interesting right here. Um, Notice how it has two values, portrait and landscape. And this is useful for smaller devices primarily because they have the ability to render content vertically as well as horizontally. This parameter helps us design an experience for these two cases specifically. And that's pretty much it for the parameters we put in media queries. The table is here for you to see it in the future and come back to it once you're puzzled about which of these you should use. You may remember that one of the components of responsive websites are responsive images. Let's have a brief look at them. The reason we'll just gloss over this topic is that responsive images are such a broad and complex topic that there's actually enough content for a separate nano degree itself. If you're interested in this cool topic, I mean it's really cool. Um, I've included a link to an article where you can get some more information about this novelty in responsive web design. Here we'll just look at a sample definition for responsive images. So responsive image technologies were implemented recently to solve the problems indicated above by letting you offer the browser several image files, either all showing the same thing but containing different numbers of pixels. So that's called resolution switching, or different images suitable for different space allocations, which is called art direction. So as you may see, art direction and resolution switching are the two main problems that responsive image technologies aim to solve. In a nutshell, so really briefly, responsive images refers to the practice of rendering an appropriate image for respective screen sizes. We should tailor the images to the screen sizes as well. As I said, this is quite a complex process that is made possible with various techniques and, like I said, a combination of HTML and CSS, both which we don't have the time to explain now. But definitely check that out in the future when you have time. In addition to media queries and responsive images, we have some other tools that we can use to aid us in our efforts to make our websites responsive. These are the three main tools that we can use to make a fluid grid-based layout, which, as you remember, is the final piece of the responsive web design puzzle. First up, we have the float layouts, which is actually the traditional way of doing things. Um, this is what most retro uh, websites, so to speak, most legacy websites used in the past to make their layouts. And as you may remember, they're not very amazing, so it's good that we have newer technologies at our fingertips. So float layouts refer to using the float property in CSS to remove elements from the normal document flow and place them independently of other content on the page. This is, however, something really difficult to achieve in a sustainable manner. So this is why we have two CSS modules to help us with this: Flexbox and CSS Grid. Flexbox is a CSS module that we discussed already in a separate webinar, so I'm going to assume that you're fairly comfortable with it. The CSS Grid, on the other hand, is the newer technology and probably the best one, actually. It enables us to create a 2D, so a two-dimensional layout, whereas Flexbox only allows us to position elements along the x-axis. In the CSS Grid module, we have a two-dimensional layout, so we have a y-axis in addition to the x-axis that was available in Flexbox. If we use a combination of Flexbox and CSS Grid, we can achieve truly fantastic results. And you'll find that most modern websites make use of both of these technologies simultaneously. In addition to that, the better we make use of these two technologies, the less media queries we'll have to write. So that's an additional benefit. And these are the technologies that are available to us for constructing a responsive and grid-based layout. Now let's move on to a bit of an interesting topic, the Google Mobile Get-In. Mobile Get-In is an algorithm that is designed by Google and gives a boost of the rating of websites that are responsive in nature. So this algorithm plays a big part in the ordering of the search results that you see when you perform a Google search. So if you type something in the Google search, the first hit that you get, so the first result, is most probably a responsive website. This shows us that you have an extra incentive to make your website responsive. Imagine appearing at the top of a Google search. I mean, that would be a big privilege to stand on top of people's search results. So that's actually possible if you implement responsiveness in your websites. Um, Now let's see what we can use Chrome's DevTools for when we develop responsive websites. Here we can see the list apart websites that we mentioned in the beginning, um, opened in Chrome, and I've opened here the Chrome DevTools. Just a quick note that, like I said in the beginning, you can use any of the modern browsers you want. All of them have their own DevTools that work more or less in the same way. So you should have no problem with a different browser than Chrome. Once you open the DevTools, you can see the icon here that's in red. Um, if you click that, um, you enter responsive mode. Responsive mode looks like this. Now here you can drag and resize the browser viewport in any way you want and see how the content will look like in pretty much any browser width. So by dragging this here, notice how it has two lines. If you click on this and start dragging, the viewport will resize. In addition to this, you can choose a specific device by going to this here drop-down menu. Right now it has the value of responsive, but you have a wide array of devices here um, that you can click on to see how your content will look on this specific device. So if you click on the iPhone X, the viewport will automatically resize to what that device's screen size is, and you will see how your content will look like on that specific device. Um, Also, this gray bar right here is where you see the media query breakpoints for this specific website. Notice here that the Listapart website has a lot of breakpoints, which ensure that the content of the website looks fantastic, no matter what kind of breakpoints or devices, no matter what kind of devices you're using to browse their site. And that's because, like I said, Listapart is a site for professional web developers that really know their stuff. And notice how, again, we don't have some kind of breakpoints that are just based on some kind of um, Apple products or Samsung products or whatever products. They're simply based on where content gets degraded. Um, that's about it for Chrome DevTools. Um, I hope that you know and you see how beneficial DevTools is to us when we're trying to make our websites responsive. Definitely use it a lot when you are trying to develop a responsive website. And here are the resources. We have a lot of resources this week. We had a lot of topics. All of them deals with all of these resources deals with a separate topic that we covered in this webinar. Um, what I want to say is that you should go through um, every link right here. The articles are not that big, so you should definitely check that out when you have time. And that's it for the presentation. Virtually everything we discussed is present in the list of the resources. Note, however, that there are many more information outlets available on the web for the topics we discussed. So if you're interested in something specific, you can always search online and find what you need. Um, let's let's just quickly open up a browser just so we can see the DevTools live. So this is the Google page. If we click inspect, we will bring the, whoops, what's happening? Okay, so these are the DevTools right here. Toggle the device toolbar. This is where you click and the website enters responsive mode. Let me dock this on the side right here so it's easier for you to see. Notice here that we have the responsive menu. Here are all the devices. Let's see how the Google page will appear on an iPad. There it is. It looks great. On a Pixel 2 XL, it looks fantastic as well. And an iPhone X, it looks great as well. This is a specific device, so we cannot resize a viewport. But if we want to do that, we can enter responsive mode. And here we have this gray line right here. It has two smaller gray lines, and we can play around with it to enlarge the viewport. Notice how it shrinks and expands. Content looks great. So that's a truly responsive website. Here you have the pixel values. So, and here the gray bar, you have the breakpoints, mobile S, 320 pixels, the mobile M, a bit more, mobile L, and the tablet part of the spectrum goes right here. So that's the responsiveness feature of Chrome's DevTools. And also, if you click an element and go through this tab right here, you can see the dimensions of this element listed right here. It has a padding, a border, margin, and it's easy to design your elements and the way they look right here. So that's about it for responsive web design. Um, and that's actually it for the presentation. Let me just get rid of this, stop. We covered a lot of topics during this presentation that are not that easy to understand at first. Responsive web design is a huge topic and is developing rapidly. So there are new advances every day. But if you persist and do the research, it turns out that everything is interconnected and logical. So hopefully you learned something new and useful today, which you can use on your projects. Um, that's it from me for this week. If you have any questions, you know where to find me. And I wish you good luck with the nano degree and good night. So that's it for me. Thanks.